Hello, my name is Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia, which is located on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people who are speakers of the Ho'okame'lam language. Today, I'm going to present a thought experiment, or rather a head-heart experiment called Education in 2048, version 1. This experiment emerged in August 2020 and was created by the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the collective, and then I'm going to describe the experiment and issue an invitation for you to participate in it. So first about the collective, we are a transdisciplinary collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and activists doing research, artistic, pedagogical, and cartographic experiments, bringing together concerns related to racism, colonialism, sustainability, climate change, biodiversity loss, economic instability, mental health crisis, and intensifications of social and ecological violence. These are all very heavy topics, and therefore we look for pedagogical and artistic methodologies that can help us hold the heaviness of these topics in a light way. So part of the work of the collective is focused on creating the conditions for difficult conversations without relationships falling apart, but also expanding our capacity to hold space for difficult things, for painful, irritating, overwhelming things, without the need for being rescued or coddled. And this is because we believe that we will need to face storms together, and we will need the capacity to exist together differently as we learn from the storms or as we are taught by these storms. So the collective describes the current moment as a moment of unprecedented global challenges, including the COVID-19 global pandemic. But these global challenges are not fundamentally informational problems. They are symptoms of a harmful habit of being with relational, affective, and neurobiological configurations that are related to our present era, which we call modernity/coloniality. And the collective is interested in pedagogies and methodologies that can prepare us for the end of the world as we know it, which means surrendering the terms of our unsustainable existence based on extraction, exploitation, and overconsumption. So the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world, period. It is the end of a harmful way of being, of existing in the world. We use a non-Western form of cultural psychoanalysis or a psychoanalytic pedagogy, which is focused on learning to exist differently, but this psychoanalysis does not center the human intellect or the human body. So different from Western psychoanalysis, it's not focused on meaning or individuated bodies. It's focused on the land as a conscious living entity. And this we learn from collaborations that we have with indigenous communities in the South, mostly in the South. So this work is inspired by post-colonial, decolonial, critical race, and indigenous studies literature. But fundamentally, the practices come from the work we do with communities in high-intensity struggle in Brazil, Peru, Mexico, and also in Canada. And most of these communities are indigenous communities. So because we work with psychoanalysis that then centers the unconscious, we are looking at this modern colonial habit of being and how it is marked by 4 denials and associated illusions. So the first denial is the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm, the fact that our comfort, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation somewhere else or over here. The denial of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption. The denial of entanglement, which is our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and from the land, rather than entangled within a living wider metabolism that is biointelligent, that is the planet. And 4, the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the problem that we're facing, the difficulties we will need to face together. And here, this is related to how when we try to address global challenges and wicked problems, we tend to want quick fixes and solutions that make us feel good and look good and that look like we're moving forward. But these things in themselves are obstacles to actually sitting with the depth and magnitude of the problems and in figuring out other ways of addressing these issues together. So the head-heart experiment today is emerged as a response to a conference invitation. The conference was called Future for All, and it happened in August in Leipzig in Germany. And it was a conference about future utopias. And the panel we were invited to contribute to was looking at one question, and the question was, what will schools look like in 2048? And this date was chosen because 2048 is 100 years since the signing of the Declaration of Human Rights. So when I took this invitation to the collective and the question to the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, a few questions emerged in our conversations. The first one is, why do we equate education with schools? So there's this tendency when we think about school, about education, to immediately imagine formal education or schools. But it's important to remember that education is much broader than schools, and that, for example, in North America alone, more than 3 million families have chosen that schools are not what is best for the children's education. So they are in unschooling, deschooling, or alternative forms of education that are not happening in schools. Or they are also in hybrid forms, right? The second question is, will there be schools in 2048? And there are different, different facts and forces that made us think about whether or not schools would still be around at that stage. And one of them, of course, is technology, right? The other is the cost of schools, too. And another one was the attempt by some corporations to take over the process of schooling and offering governments a more cost-effective alternative to education happening in schools. The next question was, can we imagine now what schools will look like then? With the current pace of change, especially technological change, are we able to fathom what education is going to look like, or what schools are going to look like in 2048 if they exist? But there's also another thing that was talked about when we were discussing this question, which is how limited our imagination is by the constraints of our current our current moment, right? Both historically, politically, and ideologically. So we tend to think that our imagination is unlimited, but it is actually constrained by what we imagine as desirable, as real, and as ideal. So if we come from a culture that already sets these parameters in an unconscious way, our imagination will keep reproducing images within those parameters. It doesn't go out, because if it does, it becomes unintelligible. So there was another question about, can we really imagine beyond our reference for reality and desirability? And the next question was, what do our projections say about where we are at? And again, it's the same thing about trying to project something into the future actually reflects more of where we are at right now than what actually is going to happen in the future. And the last question was, what happens when we project into the future without being taught by the past? And that was a very interesting question about our educational failures to learn from the past or to be taught by the past in ways that prevent violence in the future. And this became the kernel of the thought experiments or of the head-heart experiment. So as I invite you to do this experiment with me, I need to warn you first about a few things. So this experiment projects us already into 2048, and it talks about what happened in the next 30 years from now, from 2020 to 2048. And a lot of these events are related to social and ecological collapse. Now, when we talk about collapse, for some people, this generates a lot of anxiety or a sense of hopelessness and immobilization. For other people, not talking about collapse also generates anxiety, a sense of hopelessness and immobilization. It depends on what you're already seeing and what you cannot not see, where you're going to be at in terms of being able to receive this experiment. So what I think I'm trying to ask you to do is to consider whether this is the time to do this experiment and look at many things that might happen in the future that might not be very pleasant and that may cause anxiety. But if you're one of those people who, for whom not talking about this is also something that that creates anxiety, you might enjoy the experiment. We have tried this with different groups now, and we have probably 40, 60 of people who find the experiment a little bit disturbing. But what we generally say too is that education is not about just you feeling comfortable. One of the roles of education is to challenge and destabilize common sense and get us to be pushed into a stretch zone where we can think differently. And this is generally somewhat painful. So just a warning, if you feel that it's time to just stop this video and not go forward, it's completely understandable. But having said that, just be prepared for our thought experiment starting now. Imagine today is 1st of January 2048. I'm convening this world Skype call for the people of planet Earth to decide how we should educate our children after the devastating impact of the events of the past 30 years, which was brought about by human greed, arrogance, stubbornness, and unwillingness to learn. For our consultation, it's important that we remember what education is for, what the past has taught us, what made a difference to get us out of the mess, what we know now, and what we're still learning. There are 1 billion people in this call, a third of the world's total population today. Before we start our consultation, we will recall significant events that happened in the last 3 decades. What you will see next is the text of my presentation only. The images of this presentation are now being transferred to your body implants. Please blink twice to accept the file. Let's start with the period between 2018 and 2027. In 2018, the school strike started. Children were aware that the path we had chosen was both violent and unsustainable, but we couldn't listen. In 2020, the COVID-19 global pandemic hit, followed by several outbreaks of different strains of the virus. From 2022, we had a growing economic crisis, mass unemployment, mass homelessness, mass migration, localized famines, intensification of social and racial inequities, hyper-political polarization, reactionary populist governments being democratically elected all over the world, freak weather, major forest fires, the extinction of bees, extensive civil unrest. But there was a silver lining. We managed to patch up the ozone layer. In this period, schools were teaching a learner-centered, competencies-based, technology and market-oriented curriculum that reflected and reproduced a society driven by hyper-individualistic metropolitan consumers' values and principles. In 2026, the U.S. Pearson Corporation took over global online education and teacher training, offering a more cost-effective option for governments. This caused mass teacher unemployment. The period between 2028 and 2037 was really difficult. By 2028, the Amazon forest was down to a third of its size, while the Amazon store market shares were worth a third of the total global wealth. All Arctic ice was lost, all permafrost was melted. There were mega typhoons, hurricanes, tsunamis, massive desertification, and massive crop failures. The global food chain broke down. World famine hit hard. Large areas became uninhabitable. Borders were closed and militarized because of global mass migration. Reactionary dictatorships were installed. Most states failed to sustain their welfare safety net. Nuclear and bioweapons were used in wars. Internment camps were created and filled. There was mass human loss caused by 5 factors: major viral outbreaks, mostly because of permafrost melting, a global mental health crisis, incurable new diseases caused by combined toxins and microplastics in food and water, and violent civil conflicts, terrorism, and police brutality. Elon Musk started a human colony in Mars in 2035. Then the global economy broke down in 2036. It was rock bottom for humanity. The temperature rise was 2.47. Previous mitigation efforts had been too little, too late. Schooling became unviable in 2033. Pearson went bankrupt in 2034. The period between 2038 and 2047 was different. The Mars colony of Elon Musk tragically failed in 2038. In 2039, a massive event made us all suddenly realize that we were all addicted to arrogance and consumption. We needed mass rehabilitation. That we were only 3 billion people left on the planet. That we had caused the extinction of 50% of all species and made half of Earth uninhabitable. That planet Earth is alive and we are part of its metabolism and not the center of the world. That humanity is capable of both horrendous and wonderful things. Then we all had to learn quickly, collectively, and without schools, to heal intellectually, emotionally, relationally, economically, ecologically, and politically, to abolish racial, colonial, gender, and ecological violence, to care for everything and everyone, to center the earth and decenter our egos and identities, to age in generative ways, to plant, to repurpose technology, to compost, to repair, and to regenerate everything, to prioritize the commons and the common good for humans, non-humans, and the planet, to use words and conversation wisely with humility and maturity, to own up, to sober up, to clean up, to grow up, to show up, and to exist differently. So today, 1st of January 2048, we convene to decide how to educate our children for human responsibility, considering the needs of the next 7 generations of humans and non-humans alike. We need our children to learn from human wrongs, from the violence and unsustainability caused by humanity, from our repeated mistakes of the past so that they can only make different mistakes in their future. From day one, education should prepare children to become healthy and wise elders and good ancestors for all relations. Today we decide how to do this together as a planet-wide human and non-human family. So after this thought experiment, or as part of it, we invited some conversation and we prompted some questions for these conversations. So the first question was, what was the event that made us realize we needed another way to exist? Second question, what was the rehab process like? Was it painful, uncomfortable, difficult? What kept us going up until 2039? And what kept us going after that? What did we fail to learn up to 2018 that could have prevented the most harmful events of the next 2 decades? And if you could go back to 2020, what advice would you give to educators who are about to face the events that unfolded? We also asked some affective questions. What affective responses emerged during this exercise? Anxiety, sadness, resistance, relief, excitement, hope, hopelessness. How prepared are you to hold space for difficult, painful, overwhelming, or irritating issues and conversations without wanting to be rescued or demanding quick fixes? What effective work will be necessary for people to choose a path of relational maturity, sobriety, and accountability where we can face storms together without hurting each other or harming the planet? So, this exercise is currently being expanded, and new versions will be available on our YouTube channel and on the Decolonial Futures website soon. So, I hope you are going to offer some feedback on this process. Thank you for watching.